is Mark Risjord. I'm a professor of philosophy at Emory University, and I teach in the Institute for the Liberal Arts. I'm a philosopher of social science predominantly, though I've also worked in the area of the philosophy of healthcare. The specific fields I've worked with are anthropology, and to a lesser extent sociology, and nursing, and the issues that arise out of these fields. My current projects are in values and science literature, and I've done a lot recently with modeling. I've got a project with my colleague in the Czech Republic, Martin Palecek, and we're working on the models and the explanations that arise out of them in cultural evolutionary sciences. So for my project at the center, I'm working on a book. The tentative title is Impartial Inquiry, A Defense of Local Scientific Value Freedom. I'm not in love with that title, so if anyone out there in TV land has a better idea, I'm listening. As you can tell from the title, I am going to be defending a version of impartiality, that version of value of freedom. It's not what you might think of as broadband, general defense of value of freedom, where we set aside some area of science and say this is internal to science and values can play no part in this. It's more of a Weberian or Du Boisian defense, where we recognize that values have a lot of roles to play in science, and in fact, if they didn't have a role in science, science wouldn't be able to address the very important aspects of public policy and social problems that we would like science to be able to contribute to. So the idea that science is value-free as a whole seems like, that's a non-starter, and it's not the kind of value freedom we want anyway. The kind of value freedom we want, I'm arguing in the book, is something, again, more like what Du Bois and Weber were after, and that is that the values that are implicit in the production of a scientific claim ought not function in a way that means that you can reject that claim as unwarranted simply because you disagree with the values that are part of its production. So there's a lot of arguments against value freedom, and I want to take those arguments seriously in this specific sense. That is, they have good insights about the way values function in science. I want to preserve those insights, but at the same time maintain this idea that there's a certain kind of impartiality that can be defended. One of the strategies will be to look at the philosophy of science that stands behind the arguments against the value-free ideal. I think each of these arguments has presuppositions about how science works, how the epistemology of science ought to proceed, and these can be called into question. They're not necessarily the best way of thinking about science. And so part of the argument of the book is once we get clear about how the science is working here and how the scientists are making the methodological decisions, we end up with a philosophy of science where the values don't play the role that the inductive risk argument, for instance, has said that it does. But at the same time, moral and political critique of science is important, and the arguments against the value-free ideal have highlighted some of these important kinds of critique. What I want to do with these critiques is, again, build this into the sort of general philosophy of science. It's part and parcel of our understanding of science and values. Science, in my view, and this is a view I've defended in various ways throughout my career, is questions structure scientific inquiry. Questions not just at the highest level, but at the most minute levels of scientific decisions. These are ways of asking and answering questions. What's happening with the values critique very often, I want to argue, is a critique of the questions that are being asked and telling us to ask different questions, to ask questions in a different way, undermining the presuppositions of certain kinds of questions. And the critique of the questions is completely consistent with a kind of impartiality, that you can call into question the motivation for asking a question, but that doesn't itself undermine the epistemic justification for the answer. So we can pull these two things apart, preserve a kind of value of freedom, and recognize the importance of valued critique of the sciences. So I hope that I can get this book written during my tenure as a fellow here in the center.